Today, throughout the world, there are more than 4 million people involved in Freemasonry. Who are these people? Their secrets fascinate us. Their discretion intrigues us, yet the lodges themselves have forgotten from whence they came. The biggest of their mysteries has remained unsolved for centuries. Where and how did it all start? What are the real origins of Freemasonry? In the heart of London stands one of the biggest Masonic temples in the world. Officially, it's in this city that Freemasonry began at the beginning of the 18th century. For some, it's a secret society, shrouded in deep mystery. For others, it's an initiation-based group which promotes fraternity between human beings. But for many, it's a network of self-interested business people and plotters. Freemasons cultivate mystery, which in turn arouses suspicion. For the world of Freemasons, this vicious circle was to have dire consequences. This explains how in 1738, Freemasonry was excommunicated by Pope Clement XII. It was to be the beginning of a long series of condemnations of the Masons and their secrets. Freemasonry even became one of the favorite targets for the Nazis, whose propaganda used it to its own ends, the already ancient theme of the Jewish Masonic plot, which aimed to dominate the world. Such a context of suspicion explains why the perceived image of Freemasonry is so chaotic. Knights Templars, Rosicrucians, alchemists, and other mystical traditions are all used as common theories of the origins of Freemasonry. Where does the truth lie? Let's open some doors. Many people believe that Freemasons are the descendants of the Knights Templars. Created in the 12th century, the Order of the Temple accompanied the Crusaders to Jerusalem. But after the loss of the Holy Land, the Knights Templars are all accused of all sorts of crimes by the Pope and the King of France. Finally, King Philip le Bel has them all arrested and burned alive. Since then, according to the legend, there is a Knights Templars treasure which is yet to be found. Five centuries later in France, a Freemason wrote a speech that has remained famous and which exposed for the first time the Knights Templars theory. Is this the man who is at the origin of this legend?
This is the chap called Chevalier Ramsay, Andrew Ramsay, who was the orator to the Grand Lodge of France. Now he, because he was the orator, was expected to prepare lectures to be given to Freemasons.
Chevalier Ramsay is Scottish. He has fled the religious wars in his country and has taken up exile in France.
La dispersion de ce peuple. Voici maintenant notre véritable histoire.
In 1736, he gave his speech in a lodge in Paris, where he claimed that Freemasons are the descendants of the Knights Templars.
They vowed to restore the temples of the Christians in the Holy Land, and they swore to use their science and their wealth to restore architecture to its original function.
Et il explique.
And he explains that during the Crusade, these knights had two things to do. They had to build forts in which they could take refuge, and they had to fight the infidel. In one hand, they had a sword, and in the other, a trowel. And for the first time, Ramsay attributes to Freemasonry a chivalrous origin. From that time, our lodges took the name of Lodges of St. John in every country.
Ramsay's speech will live for centuries and will stay in people's minds for many years. However, the story that he tells exists only in his own imagination. There has never been any established proof of any affiliation with the Knights Templars. The same is true for all the other esoteric traditions with which Freemasonry has been connected.
Once Freemasonry had been founded with its basic craft degrees and rituals, clearly a lot of people thought, you know, this is fun. And they looked around for other branches of mythology rather than that of Masons and said, oh, Knights Templar, that will be fun, or the Holy Grail, or what have you. And they invented it and had a lot of fun with it, but there's not a word of truth in it.
There is actually nothing original in Freemasonry. We have borrowed from all over the place. Our symbolism, we borrowed from the operative Masons by using their tools. We've borrowed from religious symbolism. It's how we use it and how we interpret it that makes it Masonic.
The Freemasons were very successful at doing was making that mythic and hermetic ancient knowledge very relevant to the times in which they were living, the modern times of the late 17th, early 18th century, and they were able to bring the two together, the Enlightenment and the mythic, and produce a brotherhood that appealed to a wide range of men.
So, Freemasonry does not come from the Knights Templars. The question therefore subsists. Where does it come from? Does it originate, as many pretend, from the heritage of those who built the cathedrals? There is a nagging detail which pleads in favor of such a theory. The symbolic tools used by Freemasons, such as the square and the compass, used by the cathedral builders. Are the stonemasons of the Middle Ages not the ancestors of the modern Freemasons?
If you're a stonemason, stone building projects are pretty rare. You have to travel around for work. Once a church is built, and there's many masons been working on it, they have to go elsewhere to find work. So masons travel very often long distances. They're not bound to a particular town or city. And this seems to have given them a particular feeling they were their own people.
These stonemasons form a solid corporation. For a long time, they have had their traditions and their own rituals. The cathedral building site was immense, and the works went on for tens of years. On the northern side of the building, the masons built a wooden shelter, which remained in place until the end of the works. They called it a lodge. All activity on the site turned around this place. It's there that they shelter from the rain, take their meals, rest or prepare the work for the following day. But the lodge is not only a resting place. Once night falls, the masons put down their tools and practice their rituals. such as the welcoming of a young apprentice into the profession. These rituals are organized around readings of legendary historical stories. These manuscripts that are read in the lodge are known as the Old Charges.
The might of the Father in heaven. Amen.
Amen.
In the 12th chapter of Genesis, he telleth how that Abraham came to the land of Canaan, and our Lord appeared to him and said, I shall give this land to thy seed. But there fell a great hunger in that land, and Abraham...
Basically, they are the history and myth of the Masons back to the creation, stressing their importance, stressing that they are descended from people of noble birth, stressing that they are the masters of geometry, and therefore they're scientists, they're theorists as well as working men.
And while the hunger endured, he would ride there, and Abraham at the Chronicle saith, he was a wise man and a great clerk, and couth all the 7 sciences, and taught the Egyptians the science of geometry. And this worthy clerk Euclid was his clerk and learned of him. And he gave the first name of geometry, albeit that it was occupied before it had no name of geometry.
The Old Charges of the Middle Age stonemasons were typically English. Some of these texts have survived across the centuries. One of them is preserved in the library of the United Grand Lodge of England.
This is the Grand Lodge manuscript, number 1, which is the 3rd oldest of the manuscripts of the Old Charges, which is a roll about 6 feet long, with the invocation to God and the start of the history of the stonemason's craft, and it dates from 1588.
They're very small manuscripts, just a few inches, little booklets. And it looks very much as though these were made to be carried round by a mason, suggesting travelling again.
These middle-aged masons were not only workers,
He was a wise man.
they had a cultivated corporation with their rituals and their legends, with a highly developed spirituality.
The science of geometry.
Did these middle-age lodges survive until the 24th of June 1717 and form in London, as the Masonic tradition says, the first Grand Lodge of the Freemasons? This is an attractive theory, but one which must be rejected.
There were no operative lodges working in England. The lodge system died out, more or less, when huge building in stone, and we started moving to, in Tudor times, to brick-built housing. It all comes through as being people with virtually no connections with the stonemason's craft suddenly becoming Freemasons.
The mystery gets deeper. The stonemasons' lodges had disappeared in England, so how did the first Grand Lodge come into being? To solve the mystery, let's go back to the place and the time when officially Freemasonry began, in London on the 24th of June, 1717. That evening, at the Goose and Gridiron Ale House, 4 groups of men called lodges decided to meet and create together what they called the Grand Lodge.
Dear brethren, let's vote.
They proceeded to elect the first Grand Master of this Grand Lodge, Anthony Sayer.
Congratulate you very warmly.
The account of this event was described some years later by someone who has become famous, Pastor James Anderson.
Accordingly, on St. John the Baptist's Day, in the 3rd year of King George I, that is, Anno Domini 1717, the assembly and feast of the free and accepted Masons was held at the aforesaid Goose and Gridiron Alehouse.
And the paradox is that this event of 24th June 1717 is the founding event, because it was the first time that a Grand Lodge was ever created and that there was organized Freemasonry. It's an event about which we know nothing. No document has survived, except an account which was perhaps partially reconstituted by James Anderson 20 years later.
Dear brethren, the representatives of our four lodges are meeting today in order to constitute the first Red Lodge of Westminster.
This is problematic. There is nothing to prove that this meeting ever took place. There is no historical proof of the founding moment of modern Freemasonry. The question, therefore, is, who were the members and what did they do?
At that time, the Grand Lodge of London brought together people of modest origin, small shopkeepers, tradesmen, craftsmen, quite humble people. Finally, the model reproduced is that of the Brotherhood.
The Brotherhood is very widespread in Europe since the 11th century. In the Middle Ages, life is very hard. There is no social welfare system. There's nothing to help workmen and their families in hard times. These people therefore decided to put some money into a common pot and help one another. In London, in 1717, these small organizations called lodges still carried out a function of mutual support. At the beginning of the 18th century, the idea of mutual support is no longer sufficient to bring people together. A new trading and leisure society is emerging. Men have other ideals, and all sorts of clubs are about to be created.
This is a period in which there's a multiplication of societies, of associations, of places to go and socialize with other men. And I think that this aspect of homosociality, socializing with other men, is very important.
There are places where men, perhaps of different religious and political persuasions, can meet together to join in friendship. This all sounds very Masonic. It's what becomes one of the cores of Freemasonry. But it exists more widely.
And what Freemasonry had that other societies didn't was quite of a serious purpose. Men were going to build themselves into better men. They were going to learn how to be citizens of their countries.
Another club offers a striking example of this new mood. Since 1660, the Royal Society has as its object to bring different types of men together in the study of science. It had considerable success, and thanks to this, the scientific revolution reached Europe with the work of Isaac Newton. Suddenly came the realization that the world obeys rules that can be formulated by the human mind. Now we know that a great many of the members of this Royal Society were interested by the Masonic Club, which was starting to emerge.
And so it's important to think of the new science as not entirely scientific. They're still interested in alchemy, for example, or they're interested in hermetics, all sorts of things that we don't consider as scientific today. But the members of the Royal Society were blending them together. Freemasonry was a logical vehicle for doing that.
Very rapidly, a veritable Masonic fashion takes over London. It's a runaway success which involves all social classes. The number of lodges more than doubles. In 1723 in London alone, there are more than 30 lodges.
And then the whole thing explodes within a few years with nobles, gentry, merchants. Everyone in London seems, hey, this is the latest craze. It's not just any old club, it's the leading brand name, it's the Masonic clubs, the lodges.
One of the things that was impressed on people was that they should not write down ritual. Ritual shouldn't be printed.
It was forbidden to publish these first rituals. However, certain accounts have survived. The members of the lodge sat around a table laid on trestles. On a tableau, what was known as the lodge was drawn. There were 2 columns and other symbols or tools were added. Only then did they start the lodge meeting. Afterwards, the drawings were rubbed out and dinner was served on the table.
The imagery associated with the rituals of Freemasonry proved to be a very, very powerful and attractive one, and accrued other important elements like music, like the regalia to it, which proved to be very attractive.
The first Freemasons of modest origin are about to be rapidly replaced. The fashion effect is going to attract people with a very different profile. Nobility and gentlemen are going to make their appearance. Their entry will definitely seal the destiny of the institution. Barely 2 years after its creation, this Grand Lodge of London and Westminster has a new Grand Master, Jean Théophile Desaguliers.
The arrival of Desaguliers is a considerable event, which was not perhaps perceived as such at the time, but which is nevertheless a real revolution, because Desaguliers was not a nobody.
Jean Théophile Desaguliers has left France with his parents when he was a child. These Protestants were fleeing from persecution following the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. He will have a brilliant career. After studying at Oxford, he will become a Church of England minister, member of the Royal Society and a follower of Newton. All his life, he will be a passionate scientist and one of the driving forces of the Newtonian revolution. The Royal Society of London has had some famous members, such as Charles Darwin. It's the first organization to place experimentation at the heart of scientific research. Keith Moore is the guardian of the memory of the venerable body. Desaguliers made his mark on the institution.
So he was at the core of a network of people who were interested in science, but not just science. He could speak French very well, he spoke Latin very well, he lectured in 3 languages. So his range of contacts wasn't just British, it extended out to the continent as well.
The works of Desaguliers are preciously preserved at the Royal Society. These original archives bear witness to the scientific environment in which he lived and worked.
So here we have an account of some of Sir Isaac Newton's experiments of light and colour made before the Royal Society by J.T. Desaguliers. So these are accounts of Desaguliers repeating Newton's experiments. Here we have white light broken down into its constituent parts, red, orange, yellow, green, and here in reverse order. Many of the key scientists of this period were great collectors, that cost a lot of money, or in the case of someone like Desaguliers, needed considerable amounts of money to pay for experiments and equipment. And it's said that his house was absolutely chock full of equipment. Yeah, he needed that for his experiments, and he needed it for the courses of public lectures he was giving. He was a great popularizer of science and Newtonian philosophy. So he entered the clergy to get himself an income. The Royal Society helped him in terms of engineering projects, and Freemasonry circles also allowed him to earn a living by patronage.
Like many other scientists or artists at the time, Desaguliers has thus used Freemasonry as a professional network and lobby in order to obtain the means necessary for his experiments.
In the following 2 years, under his obvious influence, a completely new social class is going to enter the lodge. People who first belong to the gentry, and then to the nobility, who belong often to the scientific community. And finally, as the culmination of his work in 1721, he succeeds in having elected as the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of London the Duke of Montagu, who at the time is the richest man in England.
There's irony in this that Masons, of course, claim in the Masonic Lodge everyone is equal, they're on the level, social distinctions are largely ignored, but yet they're desperate to make themselves respectable by having noble members, by having leaders of the social hierarchy in office among them.
Desaguliers achieved this transformation not only by changing the people, but also by shaking up the structure. In 1721, he asked an unknown Scottish pastor, James Anderson, to draft the constitutions, the purpose of which was to organize the Freemasons and their way of living. This pastor lives very modestly and around 1720 has had a number of financial setbacks. He's heavily indebted and his situation is precarious. In order to survive, he produces family trees to special order. In these genealogies, which are completely made up, he creates for his customers a famous and prestigious lineage. He will be asked to do the same thing for the new club, the Grand Lodge. Anderson will supply not only the rules, but also a history for the new institution. However, it's not Anderson's thoughts that are expressed, but those of the heads of the new Grand Lodge, and in particular, those of Jean Théophile Desaguliers.
Everything that he wrote was checked by a committee. I mean, it was agreed before it went out.
This is the manner in which the famous constitutions of Anderson come into being. To support his account, Anderson plunges into the stories of the stonemasons of the Middle Ages, including, of course, the famous Old Charges.
He was a scholar of Freemasonry, and one of the first scholars of Freemasonry, because he did research into older documents and then interpreted them for his contemporaries.
From then on, one will refer to the constitutions of Anderson.
Probably the most fundamental text produced in Freemasonry. They had enormous influence. It was translated into French, German, and Italian by the early 1730s, and as Grand Lodges emerged in Europe and in the what became the United States of America.
Anderson will link the members of the New London Masonic Club to the stonemasons of the Middle Ages. Anderson invents a link to the stonemasons while still claiming that the true ancestors of the Freemasons are also the various successive leaders of the world since Adam. This lie is in fact political. In this way, he creates legitimacy for the new leaders of the lodge, who are also the ruling class of English society.
This work of Anderson is very important to establish the moral authority of this new organization.
If you wanted to join a club that was only set up last week, or you were given a choice of joining a club that was set up 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, which one would you choose? The natural tendency is to choose the oldest one, not the newest one.
With the regulations in the Book of Constitutions, you see the pattern emerging of London being the centre and expanding out of London and bringing other lodges in, setting up lodges, deliberately setting up lodges, and under centralised structure with a certain amount of control involved in it.
The success is such that the new lodges feel that the alehouses are too small for them. Within a short time, they've built their own meeting rooms called temples. The oldest of these temples was built in 1736 by the Canongate Kilwinning Lodge in Edinburgh. This building, which has been preserved, bears witness to the atmosphere of these first meetings, and above all, to the whirlwind success of Freemasonry. The masterminds of this success are a Scottish pastor and the son of a French refugee. Anderson and Desaguliers are both foreigners in this London of the 18th century.
You're treated as a bit of an outsider in the streets. You're a nonconformist clergyman. You're rather marginal. A Masonic lodge provides a space in which you are fully accepted as a brother.
Desaguliers, having gone through religious persecution, could well have been attracted to this idea in Freemasonry that tolerance and respect and people getting on. There's the lovely line in Anderson's first charge of Freemasonry being a centre of union to bring together those who must otherwise have stood at a perpetual distance.
England and Scotland have recently been joined into one kingdom. After years of civil war, of political and religious chaos, it seems that a precarious peace is possible. However, the Scots were still not very popular in England at the time. Why did Desaguliers choose a Scotsman to draft his constitutions? The explanation lies perhaps in a professional trip that Desaguliers made to Scotland a few months earlier. In Edinburgh, he comes into contact with a mysterious institution. Mary's Chapel Lodge. Was this a Masonic lodge like those in London? In any event, Desaguliers finds himself in a place that uses Masonic building symbols that are familiar to him. Above all, it seems to be much older than any of the English lodges. The Mary's Chapel Lodge still exists and has minutes of its meetings going back for centuries. Exceptionally, Ewan Rutherford and Joseph MacArthur, both members of this lodge, have agreed to have filmed for the first time the original report which recounts the visit of Desaguliers 300 years ago.
The which day Dr. John Theophilus Desaguliers, Fellow of the Royal Society and Chaplain in Ordinary to His Grace James Duke of Chandois, late General Master General of the Mason Lodges in England, being in town and desirous to have a conference with the Deacon, Warden and Master Masons of Edinburgh, which was accordingly granted, and finding him duly qualified on all the points of Masonry, they received him as a brother into their society. So it seems pretty clear to me from this minute that Dr. Desaguliers, having been working in the town of Edinburgh, was clearly aware of the lodge and its operation, because he desired to have a conference with the Deacon, Warden and Master Masons of Edinburgh. So it was his wish to come to the lodge.
They tested him to make sure he was a proper Mason. He was an ex-Grand Master of England, called himself, but they wanted to be sure.
I'm quite sure he would have found it an honour to be visiting the Lodge of Edinburgh, which I'm sure he would have realised at that time had been in existence for some considerable time, and would, I'm sure, have appreciated the antiquity of the lodge.
And that he decided that a Scotsman, presumably he'd met Anderson in London before this, a Scotsman, a Scots Mason, was the best bet to provide constitutions. He really knew his Masonic stuff.
The circumstances in which Freemasonry officially came into being in London become clearer. To begin with, there were small mutual help organisations. Subsequently, the nobility and the gentlemen interested in science and in a quest for a spiritual dimension took over control. Finally, Desaguliers used Freemasonry in order to create an institution and give it rules and a history. Masonic rituals linked to the stonemasons were borrowed, essentially through the research of Anderson, from, on the one hand, the English old charges, and on the other hand, a certain number of Scottish traditions. These traditions came from Scottish tradesmen's lodges that, like Mary's Chapel, had existed for a long time. And here we have a new mystery to solve. Who were these Scottish Masons, who preceded the London clubs by over 100 years? In order to understand the key to the real origins of Freemasonry, the Scottish key, we need to turn to David Stevenson. For 25 years, he has been studying the archives of the Scottish lodges, fascinated by the spirit of these stonemasons.
Just look at their achievements. Look around in the medieval landscape. You've huddles of domestic houses, 1-2 stories, and then huge soaring abbeys, cathedrals. Incredible achievements. The Mason said, well, we're architect. God made the universe. We're making God's buildings on earth. God was a kind of builder, so are we.
These Scottish stonemasons are going to know profound change. An enigmatic character is going to provoke a revolution in the trade. William Shaw is appointed Master of Works by King James VI at the end of the 16th century.
In Scotland, we call him the father of modern Freemasonry. And the reason for that is that we know that something was going on in the trade of stonemasons, stonemasonry here in Scotland. William Shaw, the civil servant, the employee of the Crown, he came on the scene and things changed.
And William Shaw is going to take his job very seriously. He's going to completely reorganize the Scottish lodges, which until then were totally unregulated. And to do this, within around 2 years, he's going to write 2 fundamental texts that we call the Shaw Statutes.
The Shaw Statutes are 2 legal texts approved in 1598 and 1599 by the Crown of Scotland. For the first time, these texts organise Scottish Masons into entities called lodges and submit them to administrative obligations. In Edinburgh, William Shaw confers on Mary's Chapel Lodge, the title of the oldest lodge in the country. Exceptionally, Ewan Rutherford and Joseph MacArthur are ready to show us their most precious manuscripts.
This container holds the first 2 minute books of the Lodge of Edinburgh, Mary's Chapel, number 1.
This register begins in 1598. This is the first time that this document is being shown to the public.
This is the first Shaw statute, as you can see, inscribed by William Shaw, Master of Work. The thing that makes the Lodge of Edinburgh very different to any other lodge is that we have records which go back for the 400 years to 1599, and it includes at the very start of our minute book the Shaw Statutes. These were inscribed into our book by William Shaw, who was Master of Works at the time.
And one splendid move by William Shaw is to insist each lodge has a secretary and keeps proper written records. What more could a historian ask for? of him.
They begin to set specific fees for admission. They do things much more tidily, if you like. And so, in that sense, he invented modern Freemasonry by formalizing the meetings, etc., etc.
The Shaw Statutes also consolidated an ancient custom of the stonemasons, the Mason's word.
Depending on where you were, what standard you'd reached, what skill you had attained, you were given a certain word or a certain handshake.
Selon les prescriptions du statut Shaw,
According to the Shaw Statutes, it's the custom in Scottish lodges at the time.
un maître maçon
A master mason does not have the right to give a job to a workman asking for work
ne lui donne pas
unless the mason gives him this job key, which is the mason's word.
c'est-à-dire le mot du maçon.
And lastly, there's another intriguing thing in these statutes. A few words laden with meaning and history, taken from a special sort of spirituality, the art of memory.
He was devising a means by which the stonemasons would preserve their secrets. He knew they were illiterate, that they couldn't read and write, so what he did was he said that you've got to, throughout the year, you've got to memorize something, and every year be tested on your ability to repeat it in the lodge in front of everyone else.
Et là, évidemment, c'est une très
Of course, it's very surprising to find not only an allusion but a very clear reference to the art of memory in a text which is supposed to regulate the work of operative masons' lodges.
le travail des loges de maçons opératifs,
Because it's obvious that with the art of memory, it's a whole ancient and antique intellectual tradition which suddenly appears.
fait irruption.
The art of memory is a very ancient memorization technique. In antiquity, it was used by the Greek and Roman tribunes to memorize very long speeches. The originality of this method is that it is entirely based on imagination.
You imagine a building. You go into that building and you walk through it and you visualize, you check on, put in your memory various objects and places in the building. And as you go round on this set tour of the building, you attach an idea that you wish to speak about at each place in the right order. And then, when you come to make your long speech, in your mind you go back through the building and pick up the ideas from the places and objects.
It is probable that the art of memory was used in the lodge in order to memorize the rituals. This technique also allowed these tradesmen to construct within themselves a house and a temple. By going round this temple, they made an internal journey. In other words, William Shaw encouraged his tradesmen to develop their own personality.
He knew that there was something within these stonemasons' lodges that was worth preserving. That, of course, begs the question, how did he know what it was that he wanted preserved? And I think the answer is simply that he was a member of the lodge. I think he was the first Freemason.
William Shaw died in 1602, barely 3 years after the publication of his texts. However, his lodge system continued to function. And it's probably here that we get to the key to the mystery of the history of Freemasonry. Indeed, a new phenomenon is going to appear. The stonemasons' lodges are going to accept in their midst from time to time men who are not of the trade. These newcomers will be known as gentlemen masons.
The first ones who joined these lodges were aristocrats who were senior in government and who were responsible for building a variety of royal palaces and castles and things like that. So there was a connection between the stonemasons and these aristocrats, a working connection.
They will come along, get initiated, and that's the last the lodge sees of them. They're not wanting really to join the social organisation, they're just intrigued by the secrets and rituals.
The role of gentlemen masons in the history of Freemasonry was capital. One of these gentlemen masons perfectly illustrates the state of mind of these men. Sir Robert Moray, initiated by an irony of history, the Mary's Chapel Lodge.
He was Quartermaster General for the besieging Scottish Army just outside Newcastle, and a number of members of the Lodge of Edinburgh were clearly involved in the army, and they admitted him as a member of the lodge.
The King said of Robert Murray, he was a man who had a church of his own. He was his own man with his own beliefs. I think he was his own Freemason too. He had his own Freemasonry.
At the time of his initiation, Robert Moray received a Mason's mark, a sign, the pentacle. The Mason's mark is an old tradition of the stonemasons. Each Mason was obliged to mark his stone in order to obtain his salary.
All of his life, Moray is going to identify with this mark to make use of it in many documents, notably in the letters that he addresses to his correspondents.
He's chosen not just a random mark, he's chosen a pentacle. It's a very old symbol with a great deal of symbolic significance.
He learned enough from that one meeting that he could moralise on his Mason's mark and for the rest of his life without ever having to go back to a lodge.
And then later, he became the main force, I think, behind the founding of the Royal Society.
Can all this be put down to pure chance? We find Robert Moray again in London only 50 years before the creation of the Grand Lodge. And it's he who becomes one of the key figures of the foundation of the Royal Society.
Due to Murray's influence with the English royal family, that the Royal Society obtained its royal charters and names. So he was a very important figure indeed from 1660 onwards. And it's said also, of course, that he was a Freemason.
Well, his philosophy was, whether it's Masonic, you call it Masonic or not, very much of toleration and mixing with men of all different sorts and beliefs. And this became one of the outstanding features of the Royal Society. You didn't start squabbling about religion and politics. You socialised and talked about science.
There were other Robert Morays, other gentlemen masons who had been initiated by the Scottish lodges. They were to be the vectors of a new feeling of fraternity. For certain of them are going to introduce into the Royal Society this state of mind that will later characterise the first London Masonic clubs.
And that to me is the fascinating period, because it's the big question which nobody's yet answered satisfactorily. Why did they do it? What were they doing? And I think the nearest thing is this idea which has been developing over the last 30, 35 years, that they were looking for a way of bridging the gap, of getting over religious and political difficulties and bringing people together.
Can one consider that these gentlemen masons and the Scottish stonemasons that received them were Freemasons? Was Freemasonry invented by the Scots in the 16th century or by the Londoners in 1717?
The Scots, of course, believe it started there. English Masonic historians believe it started in England.
The issue is these absurd words, operative and speculative, that are applied to Freemasonry. The assumption is that only a form of speculative Freemasonry could be a valid form, and that you only see that emerging from the point at which the Grand Lodge is established.
It's a matter of definition. Once you've got lodges with Masonic initiations, with men who are not stonemasons in them, this looks pretty like Freemasonry to me.
There was a time at the end of the 17th century when there were Freemasons before there were even lodges, and probably before one can even talk of Freemasonry.
Voici maintenant notre véritable histoire. Du temps des guerres saintes.
Human interrelations, far from the vicissitudes of war and conflict, favored the appearance of a new link, fraternity. The symbolism of the Mason's trade by a historical accident has served as the base on which has been transplanted a need for human contact without any particular label. This is a human need which has always been a part of the history of man. With its construction mythology, Freemasonry wanted to illustrate the image of man's internal construction. With its aim to elevate man on earth towards the heavens, Freemasonry claimed to bring a new spirituality. Spirituality whose strength came from human interrelations. Many different elements have thus come together to create Freemasonry. Scottish stonemasons, English old charges, the boom of the London clubs, the creation of mutual self-help organizations. An elite obsessed as much with human interrelationships as with scientific progress. All these factors came together and fused to create one of the most fascinating parts of human history. A rich history, research into which is only just beginning. A history which has continued to be written.